in presentation mode. Brilliant. Okay, so thank you all for joining today. My name is Hannah Hasenberger. I'm a consultant, a socioeconomic consultant at Temple, and I'm really happy to be chairing this meeting today. The last one of our Temple webinar series in 2020, and we will be talking, of course, about the 20-minute neighborhoods concept. And the 20-minute neighborhood concept aims to ensure that every urban resident is able to meet their basic needs within a 20 minutes walk from their homes. And this means that the concept promotes both environmental, social, and economic outcomes. And whilst this is not necessarily a completely new concept, with COVID-19 and the lockdowns across the world, this has gained unprecedented traction. And today, so we have united a really exciting panel of national and international experts, and they will discuss the benefits and the challenges associated with the 20-minute neighborhood, and also how to implement and implement it in a way that can maximize its social and environmental and economic benefits. So first up, we have Clara Fayad. She is the policy lead for the 15-minute city in Paris, and Clara will discuss the plans to turn Paris into the city of proximities, creating new public and green spaces, preserving public housing to resist real estate pressure, and supporting local independent shops and empowering local communities. So many things. Irene Pewteman is planning for place program manager at Improvement Service, and she will provide some insight into the Scottish context. She will discuss where the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood sits within the existing place-based working and how it can be leveraged to reduce health inequalities. Tim Emery is the policy officer for healthier places at the Town and Country Planning Association. And Tim will introduce the practical guidance document for English local authorities that the TCPA is currently working on. And he will also discuss the importance of community engagement for the implementation of 20-minute neighborhoods. And last but not least, Prudence Bales is a social value consultant at Temple, and she will discuss how a social value approach can be used to measure and monetize the social, environmental, and economic benefits of 20-minute neighborhoods. So just a couple of words on housekeeping. We will have 4 presentations of approximately 10 minutes each, and this will be followed by a Q&A session where you will be able to ask your questions. And there's 2 ways for you to ask questions. One of them is to just post them in the chat box throughout the whole of the webinar, and I will then read them out to the panelists. Otherwise, you can also, if you want to speak yourself, you can raise your hand. And in the Q&A session, I will then ask you to briefly introduce yourself and ask your questions. And we would also like to ask you to keep your microphones muted throughout the webinar, except of course when you're asking the question. And also one thing that I need to mention is that we are recording this webinar, so I hope that's okay for everyone. Just a couple of words on Temple. So we are a leading environmental ecology, planning and sustainability consultancy. We deliver specialist advice to infrastructure, public sector and urban regeneration sector clients. And our services range from socioeconomic and social value assessments to climate change advice and air quality ecology services, to GIS and spatial analysis. And we have the overarching vision to put communities and the environment at the heart of decision making. So that's enough from me. And let me introduce the first speaker, Clara Fayad. Clara is the policy lead for, as I mentioned, for the 15-minute city in Paris, where she has worked across a range of topics, including the Paris Olympic Games, economic development and innovation, and tourism. Prior to that, she worked as a public sector consultant at KPMG, and she also oversaw the Strand East Regeneration Project in the context of the London 2012 Olympics. So over to you.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. So, as you said, I'm Chief of Staff of the Deputy Mayor in Paris, who is in charge of the 15-minute city. So what we call in Paris, la ville du quart d'heure. And it's the first time in Paris that we have a deputy mayor in charge of this policy, and it demonstrates how Anne Hidalgo, mayor of Paris, intends to embrace this concept. So as I'm the first one presenting, I just want to present this concept. It has been developed by a scientist called Carlos Moreno from La Sorbonne Université. You can put the next slide, please. And it's quite a straightforward idea. The idea is to give access to all the essential services and local shop within a short walk or bike ride. So in Paris, we have set the objective of 15 minutes. And the essential services are namely housing, food, work, learning, healthcare, outdoors activities, culture, sports, and also community work and volunteering opportunities. So this 15-minute city has been designed to meet several objectives. First of all, it improves the general well-being of the population while addressing climate change, because the policy enables to reduce the amount of transport carbon emissions and thus to reach the objective of becoming a zero carbon city by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement. Second, it enables to overcome the anonymity of big cities as it strengthens local community networks. And finally, health crisis, as you've said, has confirmed that this development model is the ideal model to be resilient when faced like crises like COVID-19, and because you can rely on local assistance networks. So this vision of the city is not quite new, but it differs from that of the 20th century, in which the city was stretched out and divided into major urban functions interconnected by roads. Here, with the 15-minute city, you have a compact and diverse city and polycentric city where all essential services are accessible on foot, by bike, or public transport. Of course, we are not talking about wiping out the past, and rather adapting the existing urban fabric to implement this idea. So in Paris, and you can put the next slide, please. We do not start from scratch, as we have been invested for several years in social housing, local shops, public transport, and public amenities. And I put some interesting figures here. On the chart on the right, you can see that many people in Paris already goes to work on foot. So you have 13 to 20% of the population who goes to work on foot. And another study on the left, published by a French newspaper, La Gazette des Communes, has showed that most of the essential services and amenities are already accessible on foot by less than 5 minutes. So in many ways, Paris thus can be considered as a 15-minute city. But it's true to an extent, and it's not at the same level in all neighborhoods and not to all sections of the public. So during this new mandate, we will have to intensify our effort to achieve a 15-minute city for all Parisians and all neighborhoods. We would like to prioritize two things: the former working class districts located next to the Beltway, what we call in Paris the boulevard périphérique, and where social housing and low incomes people predominate, and it often lacks grocery stores or clinics or public amenities. And second, in terms of public, we would like to focus on the most isolated and least mobile people, especially elderly people and disabled people. Now, you can put the next slide, please. How we will achieve this ambition of becoming a 15-minute city. So one of our main challenges in Paris is the challenge of the density. Paris is one of the densest cities in the world, so we have to optimize the existing sites to become multi-purpose sites that change over the course of the day. And I put here a picture we have designed during Anne Hidalgo's campaign, and which shows our ambition to transform the streets in Paris. On the picture on the top, you can see how the street looked like before. They were mainly dedicated to cars. And below, you can see how we want to transform it. We want to free our streets from cars and make new ways for bike lanes. And parking places will be transformed into gardens, into terraces, sport or leisure facilities. And we also want to support local shops in order to have a vibrant neighborhood with a lively ground floor, what we call the rez de ville. So it's the city ground floor. This method, we would like to first implement it in schools and surrounding streets. So it's the next slide. We would like to convert schoolyards into public gardens, which are open to everyone. And we want to transform these schoolyards into oases, what we call les cours oasis. So green oasis yards planted with trees and making them accessible on the weekends to all the neighbors in order to use them as garden space or sport grounds. And in Paris, we have 650 schools and 115 secondary schools. So if we turn all of them into public gardens, every inhabitant in Paris will thus have a green space within just 5 minutes away from home. And the streets next to the school will be also transformed into what we call school streets or children's streets, les rues aux enfants, where cars are banned or limited, and trees, benches, culture, and volunteering activities can take place. So that's how we want the schools to become the new centers of our 15-minute neighborhood. I won't be too long because I want to hear the others, but I just want to mention another priority, which is to reinforce the networks of local shops, cultural players, such as bookshops, and also to strengthen the networks of public amenities and healthcare facilities. And to do so, the City Hall in Paris is able to preempt premises in order to fight against single activity or retail vacancies. So we would like to use this tool to keep local shops and independent shops, and despite the pressure of tourist shops or big brands, or now despite the risk of vacancies after the COVID crisis. And finally, I would like to point out that in our method, we would like to embrace a localized approach, because we would like to adapt this concept, the 15-minute city, to all the specific characteristics of each neighborhood. And this is precisely why we want to rely on district halls, the borough, local councils, associations, and resident and economic players to implement and adapt this approach. So thank you to everyone. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Clara. That was really interesting. Our next speaker is Irene Beautyman. So she is the Planning for Place Program Manager at Improvement Service, where she promotes and supports place-based working. The place principle and placemaking, as well as developing stronger links between spatial planning and between spatial and community planning across Scotland. Irene believes that spatial planning is about creating places that people not only want to spend time in, but where they can make lifestyle choices that promote physical and mental health. And she advocates also for a collaborative approach to spatial planning. So over to you, Irene.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm assuming now I have shared my screen. Is that correct? Great, thank you very much. So thank you for that introduction. As it explains there, I work for the Improvement Service in Scotland, which is an organisation that helps local government and councils, so that local level of governance up in Scotland. But I'm also working half of my week with Public Health Scotland, which just came into being, although in the rest of the UK we already have Public Health England and Wales. It's just come into being with that specific brief to look at a longer term preventative remit when we're looking at public health. So between the two of those, the work that I have been doing, I'm just trying to get my screen to move on now. There we go. I just want to quickly look at what the context is in Scotland, why it matters for us to be pursuing this 20-minute neighbourhood concept, what's the national support we've got at the moment, and what's the local application looking like on the ground as well. So for ourselves in Scotland, place-based approaches and working out with our silos and working more collaboratively about all the very individual aspects of all the different places is already well founded in Scotland, and we've been doing that for a number of years since we had a report called the Christie Commission that told us all that as public services we needed to work together in partnership with communities and to look at individual places and to think about the collaborative unintended consequences of interventions that we were having. As Hannah introduced there, it's very much about that impact of a place, that every single one we think of has that physical aspect of urban or rural, the social, the people, the communities, and the economic, be that jobs or the sheer investment we make from either buying or renting the roof over our current heads at the moment. And they all interact to have good or bad consequences. We intervene with the best of intentions, but I think this quote captures very much where we are in Scotland, that we sit with the worst health inequalities in the whole of Western Europe. We have a job to do that lies ahead for us, and 20-minute neighbourhoods are a concept that we see as helping achieve that. Nobody does legislate, subsidise or plan for the obesity and inactivity and depression and the health inequalities that we have. They are all done through interventions with the best of intentions. We need to work together on place-based approaches to ensure we're thinking about the unintended consequences and the impacts they're having. So in Scotland, the context that we have is we have a national performance framework that sets out 11 high-level outcomes for our country that everybody, every sector is expected to work towards. And the central theme of that is around the well-being of our people. Now, this is now 2-3 years out of date, and a lot has happened since then. Since then, we've had our net zero emission targets established in Scotland, and then we had COVID hit and the impact of that, bringing place and the role of place for all of us foremost really in a lot of thinking, and certainly in the thinking of the public sector. Prior to that, Scotland has a thing called the place principle, which asks that everybody looking at services and having assets in an area work together and with the communities to improve the lives of people and support inclusive economies and create more successful places, success being around that promotion of well-being for those that live, work and use areas. So meaning there, stop sitting in your silo and talk to others and see the bigger picture of what's happening and make sure that what we're doing considers all of the consequences of our interventions. But with COVID happening and that emphasis on place, what we have now is the programme for government that comes out every year for us and sets out what our government will be pursuing over the next year. Pulled in a lot of emphasis on place-based working and specifically around 20-minute neighbourhoods and that support. So that has really upped the ante on the level of interest on place-based working and what 20-minute neighbourhoods are and how they feed in. And it's something that has led into many conversations now of what the heck is a 20-minute neighbourhood, and we look outwards at what others are doing. There's a 15-minute in Paris, 20-minute in Melbourne, 5-minute in Copenhagen, and big conversations around what is meant. The overriding thing for us is around let's live locally. Let's have access to our daily services and amenities without requiring going to a car in order to achieve that. But another important aspect for ourselves as we move forward in this 20-minute neighbourhood journey is that concept of people, that this is about all people. So we have to think of all the population groups when we're looking at areas, and that visual on the right hand side captures that, you know, a sheer obsession with 20 minutes of a walk when we know that people can travel different distances and different times isn't helpful. This is about thinking about living locally, accessing amenities, the impact that that has on our health, our well-being, our planet, and on reducing inequalities, and thinking about that for all aspects of our community. In Scotland, we have a national planning framework, so that's spatial planning, and the fourth national planning framework for Scotland is due out in autumn 2021, and we've had a position statement out just in the past 2 weeks, and again, for the first time, a very strong message about applying concepts such as 20-minute neighbourhoods. But an important part in the wording there is that it does make it clear that this is across our cities, our towns, and our rural areas, so that the places that where we live and work are more resilient and sustainable. This is not seen as just a city concept for Scotland. Our town centres are struggling. They were struggling pre-COVID. They will struggle all the more post-COVID. We are reviewing the vision for those town centres, and the programme for government is very specific in its ask that we consider the role of 20-minute neighbourhoods as we look to retrofit our existing areas. So the issues that were being referred to with Paris and its high densities, we do have those issues in our cities, but we likewise are looking at this concept for our town centres, which could have quite a lot of vacancy and lower densities. And then how does this contribute when you have a rural area that does still self-identify with some urban locality that it feeds into? So not purely a city issue for ourselves. We've looked beyond, we've looked at the characteristics others are using in 20-minute neighbourhoods. This is the one taken from all of the Melbourne literature. And we're fortunate in Scotland because for about 4 or 5 years now, we have had a thing called the Place Standard, which sets out the evidence and researched areas that make up a place, how you move around, what the spaces are, the streets, the green space, housing, the impact that has on feeling safe and social contact. We've been working with these for a number of years now, and what we found is when we look outwards at what others are classing as 20-minute neighbourhood themes, they match across really well to those place and well-being themes that sit behind our Place Standard within Scotland. So that's a good starting point for us. Those are the themes there captured, all of the areas that the movement, the space in cities, the resources, be that housing, community facilities, local amenities, the schools that were just being referred to, and then the civic, the identity and belonging, and then that stewardship. All of those areas seen as important to us moving forward. They all map across, that's just taking one of them, and you map across the impact on behaviour change, across to the health outcomes. So important that we focus in on those areas that are really experiencing inequalities and apply the 20-minute neighbourhood thinking there if we wish to reduce the inequalities that are happening within Scotland. Very locally, an example of where this is being applied is within Edinburgh at the moment, who are reviewing their spatial planning policy, their local development plan, and were already, prior to any announcements around 20-minute neighbourhoods, looking at that concept. So we've been working locally with them at the different kind of scenarios that would mean for spatial planning. But this does mean looking at whether you're retrofitting current urban areas or whether you're looking at new development on greenfield sites, that there's a need to look at higher density in order to get that critical mass that supports the services and amenities that we want to have locally accessible. We need to do that to get that mix of uses. We need to have more of an emphasis on our brownfield land and on building on current sites rather than using greenfield, which are more distanced and therefore take more energy in order to access them and can be far more car reliant as well. So those scenarios are already being moved forward and progressed by City of Edinburgh, and other councils are already looking at that. The work that we did working with Edinburgh was to assess what they were doing against those place standard themes that I ran through around movement and spaces and stewardship. Also running them through the context of how did they meet our national, our Scottish national outcomes as well. And then very importantly, how do they meet all of those different population groups? So that's a process that we're beginning now, and a journey that we're on for how do we look at an area and start to think about how we deliver a 20-minute neighbourhood. It may be in that area seeing that there's a shortage of green space and looking at the role of schools and playgrounds, as Clara has just explained is happening in Paris. But it may be that there's another issue that needs to be looked at in an area. The solution will be place-based, and it will depend on the individual area and what the shortages are in delivering that 20-minute approach. So for ourselves then, to summarise, as we move forward into 2021, we'll be looking at its impact on living locally, not just, as I say, in city centres. What our position statement for national policy is that we look at this urban and rural. We look at how this is going to help with town centres. There's a lot of people living in urban areas that don't undergo a lot of change. How do we begin to retrofit that to our current urban areas? The opportunity from our town centres, because they will have to change their currently retail or historic retail role, there's an opportunity there to begin to use them as a focus. We need to use the data that we've got that tells us where there are inequalities to make sure we focus in on those areas as our first priorities for working. And then we need to get into some local action and start working in those areas to address those inequalities and to use that 20-minute neighbourhood concept to do that. There's an importance of looking at density. It is a crucial aspect. If you're very high density like Paris, then you need to rethink how you use your space. If you're being a lower density, then it's thinking again about how you're reusing that space as well to get to that sweet spot that sustains facilities and amenities. Also important to get infrastructure and habit change in first as soon as you possibly can. I can't, the bar across my own thing is blocking my own access to that last bullet point. I can't read it. Sorry, you can read it, so I'll just trust that you can make sense of that. Okay, I'm going to finish there. It's a total whistle stop. I look forward to any questions around that, but all I can say really is we are on the start of a journey, and we are taking a very place-by-place approach to how it helps, but it's really embedded now in how we're moving forward in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. That was really interesting as well. Sorry, can I just ask you to mute yourself because I got some feedback? No, thank you so much. Next up is Tim Emery, and Tim joined the Town and Country Planning Association in January 2020, where he's working as a policy officer, and his work focuses on creating healthier, active environments. Before joining the TCPA, he previously worked as an assistant planning policy officer at a local authority, and he also studied town planning at the University of Brighton. So over to you, Tim, please.
Thanks, Hannah. It looks like my slides aren't working on my laptop, so I don't know if you have the slide deck on you. Are you able to
yeah,
sure. On you? Really sorry, I don't know what's happening.
No problem. Irene, also, I think you need to stop sharing your screen.
Apologies, I thought I already had.
No problem. 1 second.
Sorry, Hannah.
It's not a problem. I just have to find the slides. Oh, Carla, do you happen to have them up?
I have them, yeah. So I was just about to say I have them, Hannah. Give me 1 second.
No problem. Thank you.
There we go. Is that okay, Tim?
Brilliant.
Can you see those?
Carla. Yeah,
No
perfect.
worries.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, great. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Carla. And great listening to Clara and Irene. Really fascinating. And thanks for inviting me to join. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project the TCPA and Support England are working on at the moment, looking into the 20-minute neighbourhood and some insights that are emerging, such as the importance of community engagement. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the TCPA. The TCPA is a charity that works nationally and internationally sometimes. Our mission is to challenge, inspire and support people to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair for everyone. The TCPA has done a lot of work on how the planning system can create healthier places over several years through a strand of work called the Reuniting Health with Planning workstream. And the TCPA is also very well known for its work on the Garden City principles, which date back over 100 years. We have a lot of really useful free resources and guides on our website that we've published with a wide range of organisations, including Public Health England and Sport England. Next slide, please. So Sport England is a public body under the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Sport England works with a range of government bodies and other organisations to ensure that everyone in England feels able to take part in sport or activity, regardless of your age, background or ability. Sport England more recently recognises that our built environment has a massive influence on our physical activity levels. So it's not just about sports clubs and gyms, it's more than that. And through their active environments work stream, Sport England have published guidance on how to create places for everyone to become more active, including the active design principles. Next slide, please. So why is the 15-minute city, 20-minute neighbourhood concept relevant now? I don't need to say too much about this. We all know that the pandemic has put a spotlight on the importance of the livability of our local neighbourhoods. People's behaviours have changed, with everyone spending more time locally, walking and cycling instead of using our cars, going to local parks, shopping locally and connecting with our neighbours. The pandemic has also exposed existing inequalities with differences in housing quality and access to outdoor space, for example. Not everyone has had equal access to the things that they need. And we've been able to reclaim our streets for more walking, cycling and playing with temporary measures and permanent. Next slide, please. So the TCPA and Sport England believe that the 20-minute neighbourhood concept is an effective way of creating healthier, active communities and is looking at how this could be delivered here in England through the planning system. So we've been learning from other places around the world who have been working on this idea, places like Melbourne, in Australia, Portland, in the USA, and of course, Paris. And the aim of the project is to provide a practical guidance document for local authorities here in England to help them sort of kickstart the process and also promote the idea more widely. Part of the project so far has been building a coalition of partners, including Temple Group, to share learnings and support the development of the guide. So next slide, please. And here is just some of the partners that we've been engaging with so far. And we really want to draw on different areas of expertise. So we hope to cover the many different aspects of the 20-minute neighbourhood because it is such a holistic concept. So next slide, please. So how to make it happen? From our work so far, a set of sort of key principles have been emerging for the guide on how to make 20-minute neighbourhoods happen. This includes things like creating a really strong vision so that everyone is on board with the common goal. Leadership at all levels, from mayors down to council officers. Research and analysis, so working on an evidence base to understand the level of walkability in the area. But one of the most important principles that has emerged is community engagement and empowerment. So next slide, please. So yeah, all of the places that we've looked at, community engagement has been a central part of the process. And by understanding the needs of local people at the start, what is working for them, what is not, what needs improving, and how to make their neighbourhood more walkable. Early engagement creates that sense of empowerment and ownership. And by creating that shared vision, you have that collective buy-in as well. Inclusive engagement is also really important, ensuring that everyone is involved in the process, especially underrepresented groups. Next slide, please. So, for example, in Portland, as part of the Portland Plan Review, one of the main reasons for working on 20-minute neighbourhoods is because it came out of engagement with local residents and them wanting a clearer understanding of walkability in their city, which emerged through workshops and surveys. And they wanted an objective to be included for safe, accessible and walkable neighbourhoods. So the City Council undertook a study which assessed the quality of the walking environment and access to services in Portland, which resulted in this hotspot map. And by having this map, that also allowed for easy communication and further community engagement. And Portland has adopted a target of 80% of Portlanders living in complete neighbourhoods by 2035. So next slide, please. A bit closer to home, we have Waltham Forest in London. So the Mini Holland project, which started in 2013, has been really successful, and the council there has carried out extensive community engagement. Things like local walkabouts, perception surveys with residents and businesses were used to help to understand what people thought about their area. And again, co-design workshops were then used to allow local people to help shape the design of specific improvements to make Waltham Forest more walkable and cycle friendly. And it's working. Early research shows that 24% of people are more likely to have cycled than their previous week. And because of the improvements, there's improvements to air quality as well. And it's predicted that life expectancy is increasing, which is fantastic. Next slide, please. Again, a bit closer to home in Southampton, this is a great example of a grassroots approach. So the council there is working with local people in St Denis to implement the first active travel zone in the city, like a low traffic neighbourhood. A community project in 2019 called Breathing Spaces started conversations with residents about cleaner air in their streets, which was a real problem. Things like pop-up street cafes and street events helped create a voice. With support from local universities, the project was able to develop an evidence base on air quality as well. So because of this activity, that strong community buy-in, the obvious air quality problems, the council chose St Denis to develop the first active travel zone, and a series of workshops so far have taken place to decide how improvements can be made. The next slide, please. So thinking about some of the challenges, which has already been covered, which is fantastic and obviously very challenging. So that idea of rural areas and also thinking about retrofitting the concept into existing areas compared to completely brand new greenfield sites. That perception of distance is different for everyone, so elderly and disabled. Supporting a mixed use in a local high street. If there aren't shops and local services to walk to, then you're not going to have a 20-minute neighbourhood. This year, there's also been a massive backlash against some local low traffic neighbourhoods, which goes back to that idea of community consultation being really important. So as early on in the process is really important. And the idea of local leadership, which is the same for most things, you need that strong local leadership to push projects forward. But also thinking about community engagement itself is a challenge for local authorities in terms of capacity and resources. So next slide, please. So we might not be able to address all those challenges, but we're hoping to publish guidance on delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods next March. We will continue to work with all our partners in the coalition to address some of these issues and hopefully provide a really useful resource next year. I think that's everything. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim. Next up, last but not least, is Prudence Wales. Prudence is a senior consultant and Social Value UK accredited practitioner at Temple, where she has focused on measuring and maximizing the social value of projects in the property and infrastructure sectors. Before joining Temple, Prue was the co-founder and associate director of Seabridge, which is a social value and community benefit consultancy.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Is that working? Is that sharing?
Yeah.
Cool. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about social value and the 20-minute neighbourhood and how these concepts can overlap and how we can apply techniques which are used to measure social value to the 20-minute neighbourhood. So firstly, what am I talking about? What is social value? Well, actually, this is like a little bit harder to answer than you might think. There's not really a proper defined definition of social value, but in England, the Public Services Act defines social value as to have regard to economic, social, and environmental well-being, which is extremely vague. And you can see some other definitions that I've listed below, which are also similarly quite vague, but give a kind of sense of what people mean when they talk about social value. And from this, I think that we need to move forward with the idea in our mind that social value should be considered as a framework to consider how projects affect individuals or communities' overall well-being, but it's not a prescriptive concept in terms of X outcome will always produce social value. It's very context dependent. And it's important to remember that social value is extremely stakeholder led as well. So social value and measurement, why do we talk about social value and measurement together? Later on in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the financial proxies that are applied to social value outcomes. So I thought it was important to provide a little bit of context as to why we do this. So in the UK, social value came to the fore with the Public Services Act, as I mentioned, and that's a procurement process. And during this process, public authorities and bidders are asked to prove the added benefit that they might bring. And this has resulted in the last 8 years of the development of ways to monetize and quantify social value outcomes. So that's the kind of context which we're working in. And there are many pros and cons to the financialization of well-being outcomes, which I won't go into here because we've only got 10 minutes. But it's a useful way. It's a useful tool to create a shared language of value by using financial proxies, and it can help ensure that outcomes are being monitored and measured, which then can be fed back into future proposals or future designs. So social value and the 20-minute neighbourhood. So I won't go into all of this because everyone's been obviously gone through. I think we've even got some of the same diagrams. Obviously, 20-minute neighbourhood is not a prescriptive context, and you can see examples of it all around the globe. Actually, I liked the Singapore one, which was a 25-minute neighbourhood, which I don't think we've discussed yet, and within a 45-minute city. So that's interesting. But although all of these policies and approaches are diverse and context dependent, they all have some similarities in that they want to make communities more accessible through active transport, increase access to social and community infrastructure, and they want to involve communities in this planning process. So this has massive overlaps with what we would normally consider social value within the built environment and well-being outcomes. So I've just listed a few outcomes that we might look to try to measure that are part of the 20-minute neighbourhood idea and also part of creating social value. So these slides can be shared afterwards, but these are just some of the overlaps. So measuring these outcomes. So this is the exciting part. Why do we want to measure them in the first place? Well, it can be used to show the wider value for money that the concept can bring, and this might be useful in an appraisal, in a business case, in a planning application, or public report. And then also, why do we want to measure? Well, because if you're measuring social value outcomes, you are assessing whether or not you are actually delivering those well-being outcomes that you have claimed that the 20-minute neighbourhood delivers. So that's incredibly important. So various ways that we could approach using proxies to demonstrate the value of 20-minute neighbourhoods. Firstly, a cost-benefit analysis. I think most people will probably be aware of what a cost-benefit analysis is. In this context, it's about applying financial proxies that represent an economic or fiscal impact of an outcome. So a kind of easy one, which most people will have some kind of idea of, is the value of moving someone from unemployment to employment. And this kind of local employment and local opportunities for business is obviously part of the 20-minute neighbourhood. So we would be able to use open source data like the Greater Manchester Unit Cost Database in the UK or ONS data to apply that proxy to that outcome. Another method would be wellbeing valuations. So this can encompass loads of different types of research methods. But essentially, it's about applying financial proxies to outcomes that demonstrate increased well-being. So an example of that might be the impact of increased physical exercise. And for example, in WebTag, which is the transport analysis guidance, so a framework to assess impact of transport schemes, they provide a method where you take a quality adjusted life year and the monetized value of that, and use that to apply to create a proxy for the impact of improved physical exercise and how that impacts your quality. I think the value of a quality life year is £60,000 if anyone is interested in that. The third method is social return on investment. So this is the one that is actually that I'm accredited in and that Social Value UK recommend. So this is essentially is about just engaging with the stakeholders, and they help you determine the financial proxy that is associated with the social value outcome. So in this context, for the 20-minute neighbourhood, you might want to use this approach if you're looking at the kind of more intangible benefits, say like how people feel about their neighbourhood or how secure and safe they might feel. Then this is a method that you might want to use, that might be used to put a proxy on that kind of outcome. And then there's local multiplier 3 analysis as well, which you could use to calculate how much money is spent in the local economy or kept in the local economy. This is based on like how much spend is with a local supply chain or local levels of employment as well. And when we're thinking about all these methods, we could use, and I would recommend that we would use multiple methods at once, because all of them can be used to measure slightly different outcomes or slightly different approaches to outcomes as well. I'm just going to quickly go through some examples of tools that exist to apply financial proxies. This is an evolving discipline, so there will probably be some more out in like the next few months. And these are some UK-based examples. So for active travel and walking and cycling, we've got the active mode appraisal toolkit, which was actually launched pretty recently in May. And this can help monetize aspects such as the impact of reduced travel time and reduction in road-related accidents. And then there's also the one that I really like, which is the health economics assessment tool, which quantifies the impact of walking and cycling. And you can do it for health impacts, and you can do it on the impact of reduced air pollution. And it's a really useful tool. And then you've got things like the access to green and outdoor spaces, and how do you monetize that? Well, Orval, which is by the University of Exeter, has attempted to do this through looking at how much people are willing to pay to visit open and green spaces, and that's again like an open source data tool. And then you've got other frameworks which can enable you to monetize the intangible aspects, again, the more well-being, softer outcomes, and looking at how you use surveys and how you apply well-being values, such as from HACT, which is an open source data again, to those outcomes. So those are all useful ways of thinking about how we measure social value. And then just lastly, just to end on, it is, although I have just spent the last 10 minutes talking about financial proxies, it's not all about the money. Although using these proxies is a very useful and compelling tool and a way to present value and is understandable, and can present a good case, we should treat some of these proxies with a little bit of caution. Some of them are still developing, and also obviously it does reduce complex human behavior down to one outcome. So we can have a think about using non-financial tools that still quantify and still give you a way to present your data, but maybe don't aim to put a proxy on them. So we've got things like the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Health Scale, which looks at mental health resilience. And then we can also think about things like using GIS and spatial data to create pictures of where the 20-minute neighborhood might be useful or where it's even working. So Tim also had this picture, and that's from Portland, and they mapped all the areas where people had access to the infrastructure which was associated with the 20-minute neighborhood, and that's quite a useful tool and way of looking at where you're having an impact. And then lastly, I just want to end it on saying that measurement is really great, and it's useful to show a picture and to find out what people think about a concept and value, but it has to be supplemented by that local engagement and with the ability to feed back that data into how you're making decisions in the future. Otherwise, you're just creating a nice report with a big number and it's not doing anything. And that will be really important for the 20-minute neighborhood, because as Tim has said, with the example of the low traffic networks, if people don't understand what you're doing, then they're not going to like it. So that's how I will end the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. That was really, really insightful. And we've already got a couple of questions, very interesting questions. Unfortunately, one question is very much about what I wanted to know from you guys as well. So I'm just going to go and ask this one first. So I think some people might assume that the 20-minute neighborhood is an inherently city center based concept. So I would like to hear from the panel if you think that the 20-minute neighborhood can be applied to less dense areas and how. And Mark Teasdale was specifically asking about how can we overcome the challenge of creating 20-minute neighborhoods in more remote rural areas, which do not perhaps not have the concentration of social infrastructure as city centers have. And I think, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but this also ties in with Michael Hill's question about how easy is it to travel from one 20-minute city to another one, and how do you undertake actually this longer journey? So maybe if Irene, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Applying it to any area means that you do think about those different population groups. So if you apply, my way of thinking of it is, it's when we say we want to look at a means of getting around more locally, a more walkable community, we are always taking account of those who have no other option than to use a car. So within that, we're primarily thinking of disabled users who need to use a car to get about, and that we always are taking that into account. If we look at rural areas, then there is no way that somebody living on a hillside is going to be part of a 20-minute community. That is accepted. However, they will identify, they won't say to you, I live on this hill on the side of blah, blah, blah summit. They'll tell you they live outside of somewhere. That is the place that they identify to, and that is probably their nearest local centre for daily amenities. They may not get everything they need there, but they would drive there to get the pint of milk, or they would drive there to drop their child off at school. Could they get more from that local area? Could they get more of the amenities that mean that when they need other things, they don't have to drive another 30, 40, 50 miles in order to reach them? So we need to look at the more local centres that we have and develop those. I think of places within Scotland like Campbelltown, which are off on the edge of a peninsula, but they serve a massive local rural community, and they are a 20-minute focus, so that once people get to that very remote centre, they get out of their car, they can walk around, and they can get all of the social interaction, the physical activity, and access as many amenities as possible without having to drive an awful lot further to access, the kind of things that you can easily do within a city. I'm trying to remember, what was your final question was around?
Sorry, that was around how do we organize travel between 20-minute cities?
Yeah, so I think if you take the rural idea, then you probably are a little bit more in bubbles. But if you're living in a city, I think there are many, many bubbles of 20-minute communities, and you don't sit in the heart of one and then go off to the edge and there's a wall and you can't go beyond. We have a lot of overlap, and we will simply move within those. There is always an aspect, if you look at the Melbourne characteristics and our own characteristics, accepts that there are other services that are not daily that you do need to access on a less frequent, and that can indeed be work, although we'll be doing that more from home. But there are other things in hospital visits and so on. We don't expect to get a daily access to that. But if we can achieve the daily walkable access to the public transport that gets us to those more regional scale amenities and activities, then that is the desirable way ahead. So we can't access everything, but we should be able to access the public transport that gets us there. And then that impact on inequalities is that the cycle of use of public transport goes up, patronage goes up. So even those with a car stop using it, up the patronage of public transport. That makes the investment in public transport go up. It becomes more reliable, more frequent, more people want to use it, and it goes up and up and up. So it's not just those within Scotland, 30% that don't own a car. Everybody is using it, but those that don't own a car benefit from the activities of all of those that aren't suffering from the same inequality.
Thank you. Clara, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I agree with Irene. I think that the 15-minute city is a flexible concept that can be adapted to every specific circumstances and local needs. And maybe the priority in less dense area is not to create proximity everywhere, like we are trying to do in Paris, but to create a polycentric network of urban centers that are well connected to each other, and to revive the dynamism of the city centers. And I know that in a country like France, which is a very centralized country, it's a big challenge to revive the city centers of Middletown. And that's why they want to adapt this concept of 15-minute city, and they call it a 30-minute city. And they are investing in local shops and public amenities in these city centers in order to make them more attractive and to fight against peri-urbanization. So yes, I think that it can be adapted to rural areas, and it's very important to do so.
Right, that's really interesting. And also that the concept can be stretched to encompass 5 to 30 minutes. I think it's really interesting. Tim, do you want to go next?
Yeah, just to agree with Clara and Irene completely. I think you might not be able to get the entire 20-minute neighbourhood in a rural area because, again, that's really hard to make sure you have all your facilities and services that you need. But it does come down to what the community wants to improve where they live. So that might just be improving pavements or a new bus stop, and that sort of helps create an element of the 20-minute neighbourhood. It might not be the whole thing, but it is an improvement. But yeah, it is a big challenge.
Yeah, definitely. The next question is a question I found quite interesting as well. So Mark Jenkinson asks, what positive role can technology play to support the 15 to 20-minute city or neighborhoods? Maybe Prue, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are so many ways that technology could be incorporated positively. From the perspective of measurement, there's a huge amount that could be done with GIS and spatial mapping, and looking at how people are using are moving around in neighborhoods, and how people are using social and community infrastructure, and then also obviously using that data as well, that big national surveys and also more local surveys, to look at where you're targeting your resources within your 20-minute neighborhoods or within your different localities, if it's a more polycentric thing, like Clara was saying. And there's plenty that could be done around that. But then also on the kind of community engagement side, obviously we all are very used to Zoom now, and we do have to be careful though that we don't over rely on that kind of technology and perpetuate different types of access inequalities through technology. But obviously there is a huge positive aspect of being able to reach like many more people digitally than being able then can fit in a town hall and things like that. And then obviously you've also got positive areas where technology could influence, like with like smart infrastructure and looking at how you can integrate that with the transport systems and like what's the word, how many people are like using the bus or the tram or the train, and using that real-time data as well to influence service and how people are, how you can make cities work better for people in real time, which is all quite interesting.
Thank you. Tim, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think technology is fantastic, and then there's so many different ways that you can achieve better community engagement, and building that evidence base, which has come through, is really important. Really understanding the level of walkability you have in your area is really important. And I think about Singapore, that in journey from home to work via technology, using your phone, walk, ride, bike, that journey from tram, train, that whole, it's using technology throughout your whole journey is really exciting, and there's possibilities are endless, really, isn't it? So no, it's a really important part of the concept for sure. Yeah.
Brilliant. Clara?
Yeah, thank you. In Paris, we are very interested about the data visualization tools that Prude mentioned, in order to analyze neighborhoods and to understand what are the amenities that we have to create, and also community engagement tools. And we have an interesting tool, which is the participatory budget that Anne Hidalgo implemented on the last mandate. And now we would like to increase this kind of tools. And our objective is that 25% of the city investment budget comes from proposition from the residents. So it's quite ambitious, and we will have to rely on many websites and web consultation, but also physical meetings.
Yeah, really interesting. Irene?
Thanks. I think really technology has already shown its huge impact on the simple fact that we're now really considering this as viable. If it weren't for the fact that we're all sitting online at the moment, and people who a year ago wouldn't have joined this webinar because they'd have gone, oh, a webinar, oh, I'm not very sure about that, and simply wouldn't have embraced it. And now we are all just automatically doing that for meetings day in and day out. So that makes 20-minute living far more of a possibility, because we all actually have less of a need to travel out with our area. That means we will stay more locally, and our spends will be more local, which wouldn't have been, we'd have all been commuting into city centres and coffee shops, and everybody travels into work in the coffee shops, and we travel in to spend our money in the coffee shops, and it's all travel, and it's not good for our well-being, and it's not good for our planet either. So it's had that impact. But as we move forward, I think we need to embrace that. We need to look at, when we're shaping our new places, we need to be thinking about home working hubs, because not everybody has a size of home or a home setup that enables them to healthily work from home. It could be really having really poor impacts. Whereas if we pull people together in those hubs where we still want to be creating footfall, where we need to look at new opportunities, because the other impact of online and digital has been the complete collapse of our retail sector sitting in city centres and town centres. And there's a new role for those areas that is reclaimed more for communities and more for people, but can also be seen as hubs for local working as well. So I think as we move forward, we are going to have to embrace that sort of smart city that Prudence was talking about, that ability, you know, in Copenhagen where all the lights are set for cyclists, not for cars. Absolutely love aspects like that. Again, I think a year ago suggesting that to a transport officer in Scotland would have looked very sceptically at you. Now, I believe, give it another year, they're getting asked to do just that, because we are looking at this concept. So there were digital possibilities before that may not have been applied that I think now we'll be looking through 2021, and they will actually be being taken up and maximise their potential that's been there for some time. So it's a massive impact, and I suspect there's more to come for us to realise what more we could be doing.
Thank you, Irene. I think that leads really well into Monica Laukas' question. And she asks, how can we reimagine local centres that support the 15-minute city? What specific activities or services have emerged as important during the COVID crisis? And what will need to be considered in neighbourhood planning going forward? And I think this can also link in with Mark Teasdale's second question. And he asks, is there any typology of the key services and facilities that should be included in the 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood or city? Maybe Tim, you want to go first?
I can try. That's a lot. I think definitely it's the COVID and pandemic has shone a light on this as such a massive, important process to really improve not only existing neighbourhoods but new ones as well. And that idea of typology, trying to think of all the things that are in a 20-minute neighbourhood, that is really important. I don't think necessarily need to be prescriptive, because it doesn't come at the end of the day. The concept is what matters to the community themselves. So I don't think that necessarily, as long as you can meet most of your daily needs, I don't necessarily think that you need to be entirely prescriptive about the typology. That idea about neighbourhood planning is something that definitely needs, that's a massive aspect that could definitely feed into this. That idea of creating a shared plan, I think, is really important, and that's something that is weak and struggling at the moment in the English planning system, the idea of neighbourhood planning. So I think this could definitely reinvigorate that, which I think we need to do. I don't know if that really answered the question. I kind of ramble, but I hope that's it.
I think that's great. Prue, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so I think I just really Tim kind of stole my point at the end there, but like I was very much agreeing with you about the importance of the local plans and neighbourhood planning. And I think maybe in terms of Monica's question, just focusing on the how of that question and how we do that, how we might reimagine that process is about that local engagement and ensuring that communities who might not necessarily be that involved in the past have an opportunity to be involved in a vision like the 20-minute neighbourhood. And as Tim's also said, it's not about being prescriptive, it's about presenting this idea that then can be taken forward by the people who are actually going to live in that area. So yeah, that how is really important, because yeah, how do you get people involved in that process, and how do you get them to start thinking about what would actually make a 20-minute neighbourhood happen? That relies on continuous and good, for the want of a better word, public engagement, which sometimes is lacking in the planning system.
Thank you. Irene?
Thanks. I think we can get too hung up, as we've said, on a 20-minute or a 15-minute or whatever. We can also get a little bit too hung up on what the services are. They are, in general, the daily things you want to access. Yes, so there's your shops, there's your school, there's the things that we go to. It's there, it's what we need on a daily basis. But there's more to what the concept and the lifestyle that sits behind a 20-minute neighbourhood as a description, that we're actually talking about that local living, that ability to age in place. So that's beyond just services and amenities. That gets into the quality of the housing, that it's all not just one sector of housing that goes on endlessly in fields, which is certainly what parts of Scotland are characterised by, that we have a mix of types of housing and a mix of sizes of housing, and tenements and mews and colonies. I'm coming out with very Edinburgh terms here, I realise, but you know, and we still have your detached family homes as well, but that is mixed, because that is where we get that supportive community cohesion of people able to age in the same place. They only have to move less than a mile if they want to downsize or upgrade. They can be supportive of each other. We can have older people being supported, our ageing generation supported by younger families, whilst likewise the ageing generation is there for younger families to look after children at the end of the school day for a half hour, and the benefits to our mental health and physical health of doing all of these aspects. So we can get a little bit too caught up in purely being about services and amenities within a 20-minute walk, where we're actually about that reattributing space, thinking about the density, because that is going to be crucial, that we get density correct, and where it's a very high density, that we start to look at if you're in an urban area, and Clara alluded to it with the use of school playgrounds, if we're looking at more dense living, in order to give that critical mass for services and amenities to develop, we still need to look at enough green space for people to be able to get out and be living healthy and maximise their well-being. And the biggest user of space in any of our urban areas right now is the car. Either it's moving the car or it's storing the car. A lot of car storage at the moment seems to be the prevalent preference that we have. So we need to also look at that, and we need to be thinking about the moving of people rather than the movement of the private car. And we'll all see those graphs where you can move so many more people if they're not all sitting in their individual metal boxes. So there are aspects around that as well, and just moving a little bit beyond purely being about that daily services and amenities. There's more of a community building within this. I think that comes through very strongly in the characteristics in other cities across the world, and certainly in Scotland. That's what we are keen that we don't get too caught up just in being about that.
Certainly. Clara?
Yes, maybe I can talk just a little bit about the method we are working on in Paris. And as for us, we are working on defining a typology of services that we want to offer to every Parisian everywhere in Paris. So it's what we call le socle commun, the common ground of services, and in which there is the school, which is in the center of this common ground, because there are many schools in Paris. It's a network, very dense. So we would like to work on the school, the street beyond the school, the shop around in this neighborhood, and make sure that there are all kinds of shops we want, and specifically local shops which deliver good food, local and bio food. And we also want to ensure in every neighborhood a network of leisure facilities, sport and culture, and also what we call kiosque citoyen. It's I don't know how to translate it in English, but it's a place where all inhabitants can meet and engage and speak with associations and representatives of the local authority also. And this common ground, we then want to adapt it in every neighborhood to the specific needs of inhabitants. So we will have to lead different kinds of consultation to know better what are the needs of the habitant. And we have, I could say, 3 kinds of consultation. The first one is that we are starting a revision of our local urban plan, our PLU, le plan local d'urbanisme. So it's a long process, and we have a lot of consultation that are going to be led during this process. So we are going to ask in every neighbor in Paris, in every the equivalent of the borough, it's the mairie d'arrondissement in Paris, and we are going to lead with the mairie d'arrondissement a huge consultation with every habitant. So it's the good occasion to ask about the 15-minute city. And another process is that we are one of the priority of Anne Hidalgo's mandate is to green streets and to pacify them, to reduce the place of cars and to increase the number of bike lanes. So we have defined a methodology to do so. And we have divided Paris in many districts, and every borough has identified one little perimeter each year, and we are going to work closely on this perimeter during 1 year and a half. And we are going to start with a 6-month consultation with the inhabitants to know what do they want in this neighborhood, which streets are the right streets to reduce the places of cars, what do they want to do instead of parking places, where do they want to create like sport, leisure activities and amenities. And finally, we would like to identify some pilot neighbors for La Ville du Quart d'Heure. So we have asked every borough to identify one pilot neighbor, and in this neighbor we would like also to make like an example of what the Ville du Quart d'Heure could be in contact with the local inhabitants and their representative, who are the conseil de quartier, the borough council. That's all.
Hannah, you're on mute.
Of course, this happened also. I was just saying that sounds really exciting. And I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. And the next one that I would like to take is a question from Neil, who asks basically about how can we make sure that the localism approach actually works, and how can we make sure that local independent businesses can be supported in residential areas as opposed to like larger companies and larger supermarkets. And specifically about Paris, are city center rent controls discussed in conjunction with the 20-minute or the 15-minute city concept? And I think maybe Clara, you want to go first?
Yes, as I've explained during my presentation, in Paris we have a tool which is a kind of real estate tool. I don't know how to translate it, but it's called the CEMAEST, and their role is to fight against retail vacancy and to protect independent shop and local shops. So they are able to preempt some premises in some areas that are characterized by retail vacancies or mono-activity, and then they can implement in this place independent shop, which corresponds to the needs of the inhabitants. And this capacity of preemption, before the city hall could only preempt in specific zone, and during this new mandate, we are going to be able to preempt everywhere in Paris. And it will be a good tool also to help the local shops after COVID crisis.
Great. Maybe Irene, do you want to go next on like how can the localism approach, like how can we ensure that the localism approach works?
I think in the Scottish context that's challenging, certainly within the realms of what spatial planning can do. It doesn't we don't have a system that enables us to do that. We will either allow or not allow a shop, and we have no ability then, or very limited ability, to prescribe what that shop would then sell. Primarily also because we would then not have a resource to monitor that it continued in anything that we defined on it. So I think there is a difficulty around that. There's an anecdotal kind of thing that if you're looking more locally, people working more locally, and I noticed the comment in the comments and the chat boxes about, you know, people will be able to choose where they live and potentially even move away from town centres and so on. And that may be, we have a real issue of rural depopulation in Scotland, so it may be that people do choose to move away from the central belt and to live somewhere a little bit more remote. They will still be feeding into a 20-minute neighbourhood, so they will still have an impact on that local economy. And as you move out into those areas, they tend to be more local businesses rather than the bigger chains that are more focused in cities and in the bigger town centres. So, but that is just a tendency that will happen. We don't at the moment have any means to actually control that. Whether we move forward and look at more of a moratorium on out-of-centre developments or new ones happening is something for the town centre review that's ongoing at the moment to have a look at. Can we do something more? Because there are still some out-of-centre retail being built which don't help starting to use our town centres as the beginning of 20-minute neighbourhoods. But other than that, we don't really have anything that would enable us to keep it local, similar to what Clara's talking about.
Definitely. Thank you. Prue, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really interesting what Neil saying, bringing in the kind of rent controls and that kind of idea. I think it speaks to what Irene was saying earlier as well, about it being about bringing in wider areas of policy and making sure that we're not focusing on one aspect of the 20-minute neighbourhood and bringing in other disciplines. And I think that really depends on whether or not a local authority or the overall planning authority buys into that vision of the 20-minute neighbourhood, and that would enable you to maybe put in some more creative ways of ensuring that local shops or volunteering community sector tenants take up space, retail space. I know that in certain mixed use developments, a way that social value is sometimes inserted into them is through providing space to a local charity or community partner for peppercorn rent, and then and that might be written into the planning application, or it might be in a clause in a covenant or something like that. And so it's kind of thinking about those kind of ways of involving the planning system maybe, and involving other elements of the local authority that ensure benefits are felt into the future. And that's also looking at how you manage those neighborhoods and who's in charge of them going forward. So yeah, I think there's plenty of stuff that we could think about. I mean, obviously there's changes to the planning system right now in England. So yeah, who knows what's going to happen with that really, but there's definitely ways that you could embed those well-being outcomes within within legislation or within a policy, which would influence who is able to take up the space, which is quite interesting.
Thank you. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow, the idea of local economies is really important, and the idea of the town centre is really important to the concept, and it is a massive challenge, especially with high streets already struggling before the pandemic. I think it's interesting though that there's some studies that show that certain independent shops are actually performing better compared to sort of your larger chains. So we can look here, some of the big chain stores have actually gone under, whereas local independent stores are actually thriving because they have that flexibility and that adaptability, which I think is really interesting. But thinking about the high streets, we have something here called permitted development rights, which is a minefield. So it's really hard for local authorities to stop certain plan applications from happening in high streets. So if you want to convert a restaurant or a shop into flats, it is very difficult to prevent that from happening unless you have strong policies. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're almost at the end of the session, and I think maybe we can just wrap up here. Yeah, thank you again so much for coming today and for presenting. That was really, really interesting, and definitely I'm not the only one who got really inspired by your presentations. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming and for your excellent questions, for a really, really good discussion. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.